imposed upon themselves.
Yeah. How are you thinking about that, about the unintended consequence of Russia being driven closer to North Korea, China, and Russia? How are you thinking about that axis, alliance? Like, what's the term you're using?
Well, I think we've seen two things. We have seen that, although that was something that was in the works for a long time, and maybe some of it's accelerated as a result of the war in Ukraine. But we've also seen something else that's been quite remarkable. I've been doing this for more than 30 years. I have not seen a time when there's been greater convergence between the United States and our European partners and our partners in Asia in terms of the approach to Russia, but also in terms of the approach to China than we're seeing right now. We built convergence across the Atlantic, we built it across the Pacific, and we built it between the Atlantic and the Pacific. So I would take our team and the countries that we're working with than anything that Russia's been able to put together. Beyond that, I think they're going to be, and we've already seen a lot of strains in these groupings. It's not particularly good for your reputation to be working closely with Russia and helping it perpetuate its war in Ukraine. So I think China is very uncomfortable in the position it's in, but for now, we do have a challenge, which is China is providing not weapons, unlike North Korea and Iran, but it's providing the inputs for Russia's defense industrial base. 70% of the machine tools that Russia's importing come from China. 90% of the microelectronics come from China, and that's going into the defense industrial base and turning into missiles and tanks and other weapons. We've called out China on that. We have sanctioned Chinese companies, but more to the point, so have many others, and we just saw that in Europe a couple of weeks ago. And China can't have it both ways. It can't all at once be saying that it's for peace in Ukraine when it is helping to fuel the ongoing pursuit of the war by Russia. It can't say that it wants better relations with Europe when it is actually helping to fuel the greatest threat to Europe's security since the end of the Cold War.
On China, last year on this stage, you talked about your goal of putting stability back in the U.S.-China relationship. I think you used the phrase putting a floor under it, and trying to make sure that competition doesn't tip into conflict. Have you succeeded?
I believe we have. When we were last year, I guess it was after an initial trip that I made to China, and then many of my colleagues followed, Secretary Yellen, Secretary Raimondo, and we've done a number of things. And of course, President Biden, President Xi in late November in San Francisco. We've done a number of things that are critical. We have restored regular high-level engagements between our countries, and that's vitally important because if you want to avoid any kind of unintended conflict, you've got to start by talking, by communicating, and we've restored that. And there's a steady drumbeat of these engagements, these communications, including restoring critically these military-to-military communications.
How often do you speak to your Chinese counterpart?
You know, I speak to him on a fairly regular basis, and I'll be seeing him next week, in fact, in Laos. But that's important. But it's important for two reasons. It's important, first, to make sure that, again, we have clarity and we're not getting into something that's unintended. It's also important because, one, we're able to communicate very clearly on areas where we disagree, so at least China knows where we're coming from, just as we know where they're coming from. We have that on the South China Sea. We have that on Taiwan. We have that on overcapacity now. These are critical. But there's another aspect to this. I'll just mention it quickly. This relationship cannot be put on a bumper sticker. At least if it can be, it's maybe
a very
long bumper sticker, a large bumper sticker. Because it's the most consequential and the most complex relationship we have. There are aspects of really competition, which is probably the fundamental way I define it, but also contestation, but also cooperation. And we found places where it's in our mutual interest to actually cooperate, even as we're competing very vigorously for the future and shaping the future. Fentanyl is one of them.
Yeah.
Single #1 killer of Americans between the ages of 18 to 45. 40% of Americans know someone who died from an opioid overdose. We've, of course, been going at this for a long time and trying to make sure that when it comes to the chemical precursors, the ingredients that go into making fentanyl and that are mostly now manufactured in China for perfectly legal reasons, but then get diverted illegally, come to Mexico, get synthesized into fentanyl, come into the United States. We've wanted to make sure that China is actually doing what it needs to do to curb the flow of those precursors. And this is something that President Biden negotiated with President Xi when they met in November in San Francisco. We've now seen it's a good start, but it's not enough. Cooperation, finally, on doing just that.
On Taiwan,